There is something deeply strange happening inside your mind right now, and it has been happening for most of your life. And here is the counterintuitive truth that I want to offer you at the very beginning of our time together. The harder your mind works to find peace, the further from peace it takes you. Sit with that for a moment. The very faculty you are relying on to solve the problem of your restlessness, your thinking mind, your analyzing mind, your planning and replaying and rehearsing mind, is not the solution. It is the condition itself. It is the storm, disguising itself as the shelter. I have spent decades sitting in stillness. I have watched my own mind do extraordinary things in silence, spinning stories, revisiting conversations from years ago, constructing elaborate futures that never arrived, defending positions to people who were not even in the room. And I have sat with hundreds of people who have come to the monastery carrying this same invisible weight. They arrive looking for techniques, for answers, for a way to finally quiet the noise. And what I have learned, what 25 centuries of Buddhist teaching has confirmed with remarkable precision, is that before we can find our way out of the restless mind, we must first understand exactly what it is we are dealing with. This is chapter 1. This is the diagnosis. Let me introduce you to a word I first encountered in the Pali texts, one of the principal early languages in which the Buddhist teachings were preserved in writing, especially in the Pali canon. The word is papañca. In Pali, it is sometimes translated as mental proliferation or conceptual elaboration. But I prefer a more vivid rendering, the thicket of the mind. Papañca is not simply overthinking in the casual sense we use that word today. It is something far more fundamental. It is the mind's compulsive tendency to take a single moment of experience, a sensation, a perception, a passing thought, and expand it outward in every direction, weaving it into narratives, judgments, identities, fears, and fantasies. It is the process by which a simple observation becomes a story, and a story becomes a worldview, and a worldview becomes a prison. Consider what happens when you make a small mistake at work. The original event is brief, a moment. Perhaps it lasts 30 seconds. But papañca does not stop there. The mind takes that 30-second event and begins its work. You replay it. You imagine what others thought. When you construct a narrative about what it means about your competence, your worth, your future. You rehearse how you might explain yourself. You anticipate judgment. You feel shame not once, but dozens of times, spread across days and weeks, as the mind returns to that single moment and elaborates upon it endlessly. The original experience was 30 seconds. The papañca, the proliferation, lasts for weeks. This is what the Buddha saw with extraordinary clarity when he sat beneath the Bodhi tree and looked deeply into the nature of human suffering. He did not diagnose suffering as something that happens to us from the outside. He traced it inward to the very mechanics of how the untrained mind processes experience. And what he found was this thicket, this compulsive, self-generating, self-reinforcing tangle of mental activity that the mind mistakes for wisdom, for problem-solving, for necessary preparation. You have been told, perhaps your whole life, that thinking harder is how you solve problems, that if you just analyze enough, plan enough, review enough, you will eventually arrive at certainty, and certainty will bring peace. But the Buddha saw something different. He saw that the mind in the grip of papañca is not moving toward resolution. It is circling. It is generating the sensation of progress while remaining perfectly, exhaustingly still. Now, I want you to meet someone. I want to introduce you to a young man who came to sit with me several years ago. I will call him Arjun, though that is not his name. Arjun was a brilliant person, a professional, educated, thoughtful. He had read widely, and he had tried therapy, journaling, productivity systems. He came to the monastery not because he believed in what we do here, but because he had run out of other options. He sat across from me and said, with genuine bewilderment, "I cannot stop thinking. Even when I try to stop, I'm thinking about trying to stop. Even now, talking to you, I'm thinking about whether I'm explaining this correctly." I smiled at him, not because his suffering was small, but because in that moment, without knowing it, he had described papañca with perfect accuracy. He had described a mind that had become so entangled in its own activity that it could no longer distinguish between thinking and being. He had lost access to the simple, open awareness that exists beneath thought, the awareness that is always already peaceful, always already present, now always already whole. I will return to Arjun, but first, let us go deeper into the teaching. The Buddha's diagnosis of suffering, what he called dukkha, was not an act of pessimism. I want to be very clear about this because Buddhism is sometimes misread as a philosophy of despair. When the Buddha declared that life contains suffering, he was not making a complaint. He was making a clinical observation. He was doing what a skilled physician does, naming the condition accurately before prescribing the remedy. And the first noble truth, the acknowledgement of dukkha, is not the end of the teaching. It is the beginning. It is the honest starting point. But to understand why the wandering, proliferating mind is so central to this suffering, we must look at what the Buddha called the 3 marks of existence. These are not beliefs you are asked to accept on faith. They are observations about the nature of reality that you can verify in your own experience right now if you look carefully enough. The first mark is anicca, impermanence. Everything that arises passes. Every thought, every feeling, every sensation, every circumstance. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is permanent. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is the most verifiable fact of existence. The breath you drew in is already gone. The moment you are living in is already becoming the past. The thought you are thinking right now will dissolve before you can fully grasp it. The second mark is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but perhaps more precisely understood as unsatisfactoriness. Because we live in a world of constant change, and because we are constantly trying to hold on to what is pleasant and push away what is unpleasant, there is an inherent friction, an inherent gap between what is and what we wish were so. This gap is dukkha. The third mark is anatta, non-self. This is the most subtle and the most revolutionary. The Buddha taught that what we call the self, this fixed, permanent, unified entity we imagine ourselves to be, is not what we think it is. It is a process, not a thing. A flowing river, not a stone. A flame that burns continuously, but is never the same flame twice. Now here is where papañca enters, and why it is so directly connected to suffering. The overthinking mind is, at its root, a mind that is violating all 3 of these marks simultaneously. When you ruminate, when you replay the past or rehearse the future, you are treating thoughts as if they are permanent. You are gripping a thought that has already passed, refusing to let it dissolve as impermanence demands. You are treating a mental event, which is by nature fluid and transient, as though it is a solid object worth building a life around. When you construct elaborate narratives about who you are and what everything means, you are reinforcing the illusion of a fixed self. A self that was wronged, a self that must be defended, a self that needs to figure everything out before it can rest. The mind in the grip of papañca is always, at its core, a mind trying to secure the self, trying to make the self safe, certain, and permanent. And this effort, however sincere, however exhausting, is doomed from the beginning. Because the self it is trying to protect is not the kind of thing that can be made permanent. It is, like everything else, a flowing process. This is the profound irony that the Buddha illuminated. The very anxiety that drives overthinking is rooted in a misunderstanding of what you are. And the more the mind works to resolve that anxiety through thinking, the more it reinforces the misunderstanding. Let me offer you now one of the most powerful and compassionate metaphors in the entire Buddhist teaching tradition. It comes from the Samatha Sutta, the Arrow Discourse, and it has stayed with me for as long as I have been a monk. The Buddha described 2 arrows. The first arrow is the original pain, the difficulty, the loss, the mistake, the disappointment. This arrow lands. It hurts. The pain is real. The Buddha never denied this, when he never said that life's difficulties are illusions or that pain does not matter. The first arrow is part of being alive, and we do not always have the power to avoid it. But then there is the second arrow, and this one we fire ourselves. The second arrow is the mental elaboration that follows the first. It is the self-judgment, the catastrophizing, the endless replaying, the "why did this happen to me?" the "what does this mean about my life?" the "how could I have been so foolish?" The second arrow is papañca in action, and here is the teaching as it is often presented. The first arrow may be unavoidable. With training, the second arrow can be avoided or greatly reduced. Think about Arjun, sitting across from me in the monastery garden. The original wound in his life, the first arrow, was real. There had been genuine difficulty and genuine loss. But what had consumed him for years was not the first arrow. It was the hundreds of second arrows he had fired into himself through relentless rumination. Each time he revisited the wound, he wounded himself again. Each time he asked why, he opened the cut wider. The mind, trying desperately to think its way to healing, was a very instrument of continued harm. When I explained this to him, he sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "So the problem isn't what happened to me. The problem is that I never let it stop happening." Yes, precisely. That is it. The untrained mind does not know how to let experience complete itself. It intercepts the natural arc of arising and passing, the natural movement of anicca, and holds on. It grips the thought, turns it over, examines it from every angle, and in doing so, keeps it perpetually alive. The experience that should have lasted a moment lasts a decade. Not because the original wound was so deep, but because papañca would not allow it to heal. And here is the paradox I want you to carry with you into everything that follows. The paradox that is the beating heart of this entire teaching. The mind that is most desperately seeking peace through thinking is the mind that is most thoroughly preventing peace from arising. Peace is not found at the end of a thought. It is not the conclusion of a particularly successful bout of analysis. It is not the reward waiting for you after you have finally figured everything out. Peace is what remains when the compulsive proliferation of thought is allowed to settle. It is not something you build, and it is something you uncover. It was there all along, beneath the thicket, beneath the noise, beneath the second arrows, patient, unchanged, waiting. The Buddha knew this. He did not arrive at enlightenment by thinking harder. He arrived by learning to see the nature of thought itself, to observe it without being captured by it, to watch it arise without following it into the thicket. This is what we will explore together. Not a way to stop thinking. That is not the goal, and I will address that misunderstanding directly in what follows, but a way to change your relationship to thought so profoundly that the thicket loses its power over you, so that you can stand at the edge of the mind's proliferation and choose, with clarity and compassion, whether to enter. Arjun stayed at the monastery for 3 days. On the morning he left, when he came to find me in the garden, he looked different, not transformed, not enlightened, but quieter, as if something had been set down. He said, "I think I've been trying to solve myself, and maybe I'm not a problem to be solved." That is where we begin. The diagnosis is complete. Now let us find the remedy. So, the diagnosis is complete. And now you may be wondering, as Arjun wondered, as nearly everyone who comes to sit with me wonders, what exactly does one do with this understanding? Knowing the name of the thicket does not automatically free you from it. Knowing that papañca is the mechanism does not, by itself, quiet the proliferation. The mind can even take this new knowledge and begin to elaborate upon it. It can begin thinking about its own thinking, analyzing its own analyzing, which is simply papañca wearing a new coat. This is why the Buddha did not stop at diagnosis. He was not a philosopher who described the problem and left you to contemplate it in the dark. He was a physician, and a physician who names the illness but offers no treatment has not yet finished their work. What follows is the treatment. Not in the sense of a cure administered to you from the outside, but in the sense of a path, a way of walking through the world that gradually, systematically, and with great compassion for your own struggles, transforms your relationship to the restless mind. The Buddha called this path the Noble Eightfold Path, and it is one of the most sophisticated psychological frameworks ever devised. It has been refined and practiced for 25 centuries. And while all 8 aspects of this path matter profoundly, I want to draw your attention today to 2 in particular. The 2 that speak most directly to the condition we have been examining. The 7th factor of the Eightfold Path is right mindfulness. The 8th is right concentration. Together, they form something like the 2 banks of a river. Between them, the current of awareness flows with clarity and direction. Let me begin with right mindfulness, because it is the foundation on which everything else in this chapter rests. Mindfulness, in Pali Sati, is often misrepresented in modern culture as a kind of soft, pleasant relaxation, a warm bath for the mind. But this is not what Sati means in the Buddhist tradition. Sati means clear, precise, non-reactive awareness of what is actually happening in your body, in your mind, in this moment, without addition, without subtraction, without the commentary of papañca layered on top. It is not the absence of experience. It is the presence of a witness that does not interfere. Think of it this way. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a busy road, watching traffic pass. Cars come, cars go. Some are fast, some slow. Some are loud. You observe them. You do not run into the road and climb into each car as it passes. You do not chase after the cars that have already gone by. You do not stand in the road trying to stop the cars from coming. You simply stand at the edge and watch. This is sati. This is what right mindfulness actually looks like when applied to the mind. Thoughts are the traffic. You are the one standing at the edge. The untrained mind, the mind in the grip of papañca, does not stand at the edge. It runs into the road. It climbs into every passing car. It is carried away before it even realizes what has happened. And then, miles down the road, it wonders how it got so far from where it meant to be. Right concentration, samadhi, is the complementary practice, where mindfulness is the quality of clear, open awareness. Concentration is the capacity to sustain that awareness on a chosen object without being pulled away. It is the stability that gives mindfulness its power. A mind that can rest, that can remain with a single point of attention for more than a few seconds without scattering, is a mind that has begun to free itself from the tyranny of papañca. Because papañca cannot survive in a concentrated mind. The thicket requires the mind to keep moving, keep generating, keep elaborating. Concentration is stillness, and in stillness, the thicket begins to thin. Now, let me be precise about how these two qualities are cultivated, because this is where we move from principle to practice. And practice is everything. There are two great meditation traditions within Buddhism that directly address the proliferating mind, and they correspond almost exactly to the two qualities I have just described. The first is Samatha, calm abiding. The second is Vipassana, insight meditation. They are not opposites, they are partners, but they work differently, and understanding how they work will help you choose the right tool for the right moment. Samatha meditation is the practice of settling the mind by anchoring it to a single object, most commonly the breath. You sit, you close your eyes, you bring your attention to the sensation of breathing, the subtle movement of air at the nostrils, the rise and fall of the chest or belly. When the mind wanders, and it will wander, this is not failure. This is simply the nature of the untrained mind. You notice that it has wandered, and you return, gently, without self-judgment. You return. This returning is the practice, not the staying, the returning. Every time you notice that you have been carried away by a thought, and you choose to come back to the breath, you are strengthening something. You are building the muscle of sati. You are practicing, in miniature, the very skill you need in daily life, the skill of noticing when papañca has captured you and choosing to step back to the edge of the road. Studies in contemplative neuroscience, and I say this carefully, as someone whose primary authority is practice rather than laboratory research, suggest that regular samatha practice is associated with measurable changes in the brain's capacity for sustained attention and emotional regulation. Many practitioners across traditions report that even brief periods of daily calm abiding practice begin to create gaps in the thought stream, small silences where there was previously only noise. I have seen this in my own practice. I have seen it in the people who come to sit with us. The gaps begin small, a breath, a second, but they grow. And in those gaps, something extraordinary waits. Vipassana works differently. Where Samatha calms the surface of the water, Vipassana looks into the depths. In Vipassana practice, rather than anchoring to a single object and maintaining focus, you open your awareness to whatever arises: thoughts, sensations, emotions, sounds, and you observe each arising with precise, non-reactive attention. You watch the thought come, you watch it peak, you watch it pass. You do not follow it, you do not push it away. You simply observe its complete arc, arising, existing briefly, dissolving. This is impermanence practice in its most direct form, and it is one of the most powerful antidotes to papañca that I know, because papañca depends on a particular illusion. The illusion that thoughts are solid, significant, and deserving of your complete investment. Vipassana dismantles this illusion experientially, not intellectually. You do not convince yourself that thoughts are impermanent. You watch them be impermanent, moment after moment, until the truth of it becomes undeniable, until the mind begins to loosen its grip on its own productions, because it has seen again and again that they arise and pass like clouds, like breath, like everything else in this vast, flowing, impermanent universe. This is the practice I want to invite you to try, not tomorrow, not when you have more time, but today, tonight. Sit somewhere quiet for just 10 minutes. You do not need cushions or incense or a meditation room. Sit in a chair if that is what you have. Close your eyes. Breathe naturally. And when a thought arises, any thought, do not engage with it. Do not follow the story. Simply note it. In the Vipassana tradition, we use simple labels: thinking, planning, remembering, worrying. Just the label, gently applied, and then a return to open awareness. The label is not a judgment. It is simply a way of stepping back, of becoming the observer rather than the participant, of standing at the edge of the road. Now, I want to introduce you to a concept that comes not from the early Buddhist and Theravada contexts, where Samatha and Vipassana are especially emphasized, but from the Zen tradition. And it is one of the most quietly radical ideas I have ever encountered. The Japanese word is shoshin. It is usually translated as beginner's mind. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki wrote that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. This is worth sitting with. Because the overthinking mind, the mind saturated with papañca, is in a very real sense an expert's mind. It is a mind so full of accumulated narratives, conclusions, judgments, and fixed interpretations that it has lost the capacity to encounter anything freshly. It meets each new moment already knowing what it means. It meets each new person already knowing who they are. It meets each new experience already filtered through the thick sediment of everything it has previously decided. Arjun was like this. When he sat across from me, he wasn't actually in that garden. He was in every previous conversation he had analyzed, every previous attempt at healing that had failed, every previous moment in which he had tried to understand himself and come up short. He was carrying all of it into the present, and the weight of it left no room for the present itself. Shoshin is the practice of setting that weight down. Not permanently. I am not asking you to forget everything you know, but deliberately, consciously, as a practice, approaching a moment as if for the first time. The next conversation you have, what if you listen to it as if you had never spoken to this person before? The next breath you take, what if you felt it as if it were the first breath you had ever drawn? the next difficult emotion that arises. What if, instead of immediately filing it into the category of this again, you met it with genuine curiosity? What is this exactly? What does it actually feel like right now, in this body, in this moment? This is not naivety. This is precision. Because the truth is, this moment has never happened before. This breath is not the same breath as the last one. This version of you, reading these words, has never existed before and will never exist again. The beginner's mind is simply the mind that is honest enough to acknowledge this, honest enough to release the accumulated narratives long enough to actually be here. Let me bring in one more framework because it is one that I find both intellectually rigorous and practically transformative. And it comes from one of the most sophisticated psychological systems in the entire Buddhist tradition. It is called the Abhidharma, and it is, in essence, a detailed map of the mind's moment-to-moment functioning. The Abhidharma teaches that consciousness does not flow in a continuous stream, as we tend to experience it. Rather, it arises in discrete moments, what the tradition calls citta, or consciousness moments, each one arising and passing in an extraordinarily brief flash of time, each one conditioned by what came before it and conditioning what comes after. The sense of a continuous, unbroken stream of thoughts is, according to this model, a kind of perceptual illusion. Like the way a series of still images, shown rapidly enough, creates the illusion of a moving picture. Why does this matter for overthinking? Because it reveals something profound about the nature of thought itself. A thought is not a solid, permanent object sitting in your mind like a stone in a room. It is a momentary arising, a brief flash of mental activity that is already passing even as it appears. The problem is not the thought. The thought, by itself, lasts a fraction of a second. The problem is the next thought, which grabs the first one, and the thought after that, which elaborates on both of them, and so on, until you have constructed an entire architecture of mental suffering from a series of events that were, individually, almost instantaneous. The Abhidharma model is liberating because it shows you exactly where the intervention is possible. Between one consciousness moment and the next, there is a gap, a space of choice, however small. Mindfulness practice is, in part, the practice of widening that gap, of creating enough space between the arising of a thought and your response to it that you can choose whether to elaborate, whether to follow, whether to enter the thicket, or whether to simply let the moment pass, as all moments do, and wait for the next one with open hands. This is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of the middle way, not the middle between two extremes of philosophy or lifestyle alone, though it includes that, but the middle between suppression and indulgence, the middle between forcing the mind into silence and being swept away by its every production. You do not strangle the thought, you do not chase it. You stand in the middle, awake, present, unmoved, and you watch it complete its natural arc. If these teachings are landing somewhere real in you, if something in what I am sharing is speaking to a part of you that has been quietly waiting for this kind of language, I want to invite you to stay with us on this path. Share this with someone you know who is carrying the weight of a restless mind. We walk this path together, none of us ahead, none of us behind. I want to return to Arjun one more time, because on his second day at the monastery, something happened that I think will illuminate everything we have discussed. I had given him a simple instruction. Nothing elaborate, nothing mystical. I told him to sit for 20 minutes in the morning and simply watch his thoughts arise and pass, labeling each one gently, thinking, planning, remembering, nothing more. He came to me afterward, looking mildly frustrated. He said, I had hundreds of thoughts. I couldn't stop them. And I told him what I will tell you now. That is not failure. That is the practice working exactly as it should. You are not meditating in order to have no thoughts. You are meditating in order to see thoughts clearly, to see them as events in consciousness rather than as a truth about reality. Every thought you noticed and labeled was a moment of freedom. Every return to awareness was a step back from the edge of the road. The hundreds of thoughts were not the problem. The noticing was the victory. On the morning of his third day, the morning he left, Arjun sat with me in the garden, and for a while we said nothing. The birds were loud. The light was coming through the trees in that particular way it does in early morning, when everything looks as if it has just been placed there for the first time. And Arjun looked at the light for a long moment and said quietly, I think I've been so busy thinking about my life that I forgot to live it. Yes, that is it. That is the whole teaching, distilled into one sentence. The path through the storm is not around it. It is not above it. It is directly through it, with clear eyes, an open heart, and the willingness to stand at the edge of the mind's great proliferation and choose, moment by moment, not to be carried away. The tools are in your hands now. Right mindfulness, right concentration, the calm of Samatha, the clarity of Vipassana, the freshness of Shoshin, the precision of understanding thought as a momentary arising, not a permanent truth. These are not ideas to be thought about. They are practices to be lived, and in the living of them, something begins to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a season shifts, gradually, imperceptibly, until one morning you step outside and realize that something has changed. The air is different. The light is different. You are different. The storm has not stopped, but you have found the stillness at its center. And now we arrive at something I want you to feel, rather than simply understand. We have traveled a considerable distance together, you and Arjun, and the 25 centuries of practitioners who walked this path before any of us arrived. We began with a counterintuitive claim that the mind working hardest to find peace is the very obstacle to peace. We named the thicket papañca, that compulsive, self-generating proliferation that takes a single moment of experience and spins it into an entire world of suffering. We looked honestly at the second arrow, the one we fire into ourselves. We examined the 3 marks of existence and saw how the overthinking mind is, at its root, a mind in rebellion against the nature of reality itself, clinging to permanence where there is none, constructing a fixed self where there is only flow. And then we found the tools: right mindfulness, right concentration, the settling of Samatha, the penetrating clarity of Vipassana, and the radical freshness of Shoshin. The Abhidharma's revelation that thought is not a stone in a room, but a flash of lightning, brief, already passing, only dangerous if you reach out and hold the bolt. Now we return to where we began, not because we have gone in a circle, but because this is how genuine understanding works. You return to the beginning and find that it has changed. Or rather, you have changed, and so the beginning looks different now. Let me ask you something. When you first heard the word papañca, when I first described the thicket of the mind, what did you feel? Perhaps recognition, perhaps a quiet relief that there was a name for something you had been living with for years, perhaps a faint anxiety, because naming a thing makes it real in a new way, and making it real means you can no longer pretend it is not there. But here is what I want you to see now, from this vantage point, having traveled this far. Papañca is not your enemy. It never was. It is a function of a mind that is alive, engaged, and deeply invested in its own continuity. It is the mind doing what minds do, reaching, grasping, elaborating, without yet having learned that it can rest. The diagnosis was never a condemnation. It was a compassionate act of recognition. And recognition, in the Buddhist tradition, is always the first movement of liberation. The circle is complete, not when the problem disappears, but when you can hold the problem differently. When the thicket no longer terrifies you, because you have stood at its edge enough times to know that you are not the thicket. You are the awareness in which the thicket appears. This is the whole teaching. Let it land. By now, I want to share with you something that took me many years to truly understand. Something that sounds almost disappointingly simple when you first hear it, and yet contains within it one of the most profound reorientations of mind I have ever encountered. It comes from the Zen tradition. In a famous exchange recorded in the Gateless Gate, Jiaozhou asked his teacher Nansen what the way is, and Nansen replied, "Ordinary mind is the way. Ordinary mind is the way. Not the extraordinary mind, not the mind that has achieved some elevated state of permanent bliss, floating above the difficulties of ordinary life. Not the mind that has finally, definitively, once and for all, stopped thinking. The ordinary mind. The mind that is tired sometimes, and distracted sometimes, and sad sometimes, and occasionally irritated by small things. And the mind that wanders and returns. The mind that forgets and remembers. The mind that is, in this moment, exactly what it is. I have watched so many people arrive at practice with a secret fantasy. The fantasy is this, that if they meditate correctly and long enough, they will eventually reach a state where the restless mind simply stops, where peace becomes a permanent possession, like a house they move into and never have to leave, where the work is finished, where they arrive. This fantasy is understandable. It is also, I must tell you gently, a form of papañca. It is the proliferating mind projecting a future state of non-proliferation, which is, if you look at it directly, a rather elegant trap. The mind uses its own restlessness to construct an image of its own perfect stillness, and then begins to chase that image. And the chase itself is the problem. Nansen's teaching in this koan cuts through this with extraordinary precision. The way is not a destination you reach. It is a quality of attention you practice, continuously, imperfectly, in the middle of ordinary life. Inner peace is not a place you arrive at and then stay. It is a place you return to again and again, each time you notice you have wandered. The practice is the returning, not the staying. This is what I tried to tell Arjun when he reported his hundreds of thoughts with such frustration. Every return is the practice. Every return is the way. And this means something extraordinary. It means that this moment, right now, exactly as it is already the path. Not the preparation for the path, not the approach to the path itself. You are already on it. Now you have never been off it. Even in your most tangled, most proliferating, most exhausted moments of overthinking, you were on the path, You were simply not yet aware of it. Ordinary mind is the way. Let that breathe through you. Now I want to introduce you to one more teaching, and it is one that I have found to be among the most practically powerful antidotes to the self-referential spiral of overthinking. It comes from the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, and it centers on a figure called the Bodhisattva. In the Mahayana understanding, a bodhisattva is a being who has dedicated their life and practice not merely to their own liberation, but to the liberation of all sentient beings. The Bodhisattva vow, the aspiration to remain engaged with the world until all beings are free from suffering, is not primarily a moral statement. It is a psychological one, and its implications for the overthinking mind are profound. Consider what happens in the mind when it is caught in papañca. It is, almost without exception, turned inward. It is thinking about itself, its past, its future, its failures, its fears, its reputation, its safety, its worth. The self-referential loop is the engine of mental proliferation. The mind circles itself endlessly, feeding on its own productions, mistaking this circling for depth when it is actually a very sophisticated form of confinement. Now consider what happens when genuine attention shifts outward, when you ask, not, what does this mean about me, but how can I be of service here? When you move through a difficult situation, not with the question, how do I protect myself, but how can I contribute to the well-being of this moment? Something loosens, something releases. The self-referential loop, deprived of its fuel, begins to quiet. This is not self-abandonment. I want to be precise about this. The Bodhisattva ideal does not ask you to disappear. It asks you to expand, to widen the circle of your concern until it includes more than just the anxious, proliferating self. And in that widening, paradoxically, the self becomes less of a problem, not because it has been eliminated, but because it has been contextualized, placed within a larger field of relationship, of interdependence, of what the Buddha called dependent origination. The truth that nothing exists in isolation, that every being and every moment arises in relationship to everything else. The next time you find yourself caught in the spiral, replaying, rehearsing, catastrophizing, try this. Ask yourself one question and let it be genuine. Who else is here? Not in a philosophical sense. Practically. Who else is in this situation with you? What are they carrying? What might they need? What would it look like to be fully present to them, rather than to the story your mind is constructing about them? This is not a technique for avoiding your own experience. It is a technique for discovering that your own experience is not as sealed and separate as papañca makes it feel. You are not a closed system. You are a node in an infinite web of connection. And when you remember this, when you feel it, not just think it, the weight of the self-referential mind becomes lighter. Not because the weight was removed, but because it is now being shared with the whole of existence. I have seen this work. I have seen people who came to the monastery consumed by their own internal weather step outside of it. Not through force, not through suppression, but through the simple act of genuinely caring about another person. A conversation in which they forgot for a moment to monitor themselves. A moment of service in which the self stepped aside long enough for something larger to move through. And in those moments, they reported the same thing, again and again. Peace. Not the peace they had been chasing. The peace that was always already there, waiting beneath the noise of self-concern. Well, this is the Bodhisattva path, not a path for saints alone. a path for anyone willing to widen their attention beyond the borders of their own anxious mind. Now, I want to address something directly, because I have seen this misunderstanding cause real harm, and I want to clear it before we close. Many people come to Buddhist practice believing, consciously or not, that the goal is to stop thinking. They sit in meditation and measure their progress by how few thoughts arise. They feel they have failed when the mind wanders. They become frustrated, even angry, at the very mind they are trying to quiet, which is, of course, simply papañca about papañca, the thicket growing thicker in the attempt to thin it. Let me be absolutely clear. The goal of Buddhist practice is not the elimination of thought. Thought is not the enemy. The Buddha thought, the great master's thought. You will think until the last moment of your life, and this is not a problem. Thought is a magnificent capacity of the human mind. It has built civilizations, written poetry, discovered the nature of the cosmos, and composed the very teachings we have been exploring together. The goal, the precise, carefully articulated goal, is non-attachment to thought. The ability to allow thought to arise and pass without being captured by it, without mistaking it for ultimate truth, without following it into the thicket. The difference between a mind enslaved by its thoughts and a liberated mind is not the number of thoughts. It is the relationship to them. A liberated mind thinks, but it holds its thoughts lightly, the way you might hold a butterfly, present, attentive, but with an open hand. The butterfly is free to rest and free to go. You do not grip it. You do not chase it when it flies away. You simply notice it, appreciate it for what it is, and remain open to whatever comes next. This is what the practice builds, not silence, not blankness, not a mind scrubbed clean of all content, but a mind that has learned to be the sky rather than the weather, vast, open, undisturbed by the clouds that move through it, however dark, however loud, however insistent those clouds may be. You are the sky. You have always been the sky. The practice is simply the ongoing, patient, compassionate remembering of this. And now, I want to offer you one final image. It is an image that has been central to Buddhist teaching and iconography for centuries, and I have returned to it countless times in my own practice, in moments of difficulty and in moments of clarity alike. It is the image of the lotus flower. The lotus grows in mud. Not in spite of the mud, because of it. The mud is the condition of its arising. Without the dark, murky, imperfect water at the bottom of the pond, the lotus cannot grow. It needs that darkness. It needs that depth. It sends its roots down into what is messy and unclear and difficult, and from that rootedness it rises, and it blooms, and it rests on the surface of the water, clean and luminous, touching the light. And I want you to hear this carefully, because this is the teaching I most want to leave with you. Your overthinking mind, the mind that has caused you so much exhaustion, so much suffering, so many sleepless nights and tangled days, is not the obstacle to your awakening. It is the mud in which your awakening is rooted. The very intensity of your mental life, the very depth of your capacity for reflection and feeling and self-examination is the ground from which something extraordinary can grow. The lotus does not apologize for the mud. It uses it. It transforms it. Not by escaping it, but by being rooted in it so completely that the transformation becomes inevitable. Every moment of papañca you have lived through has taught you something about the nature of the mind. Every second arrow you have fired has shown you, eventually, that you were the one holding the bow, and that you can choose to set it down. Every time you have been lost in the thicket and found your way back to the edge of the road, you have strengthened the very capacity for awareness that is the heart of this practice. Nothing has been wasted, not one moment of your restlessness, not one night of rumination, not one anxious spiral. All of it has been, in its own way, the practice. All of it has been the mud, and from this mud, from this very mind, with all its proliferations and second arrows and thickets and storms, awareness is already rising. It rose the moment you began to pay attention. It rose the moment you heard the word papañca and felt something in you say, yes, I know this. It rose every time you sat for 10 minutes and watched a thought arise and pass without following it. It rises now as you listen, as something in you receives these words, not just as information, but as recognition, as coming home. Arjun sent a letter to the monastery some months after his visit. He wrote that he still had difficult days, that the mind still proliferated, still fired second arrows sometimes, still got lost in the thicket. But he wrote something else that I have kept with me. He wrote, "The difference is that now I know I'm in the thicket, and knowing that, I can find my way back. I always find my way back." Yes, that is it. That is the whole of the practice and the whole of the path, distilled into its essence. Not the elimination of wandering, the capacity to return again and again and again, without shame, without judgment, with the gentle persistence of someone who has understood that the returning is not a sign of failure. The returning is the practice. The returning is the path. The returning is the way. You came to this teaching carrying the weight of a restless mind. I hope you leave it, not lighter in the sense of having put something down, but lighter in the sense of having understood what you are carrying. The weight is not the enemy. The mud is not the enemy. The thicket is not the enemy. They are the conditions. They are the mud from which the lotus rises. And you who have sat with me through all of this, who have followed this thread from the first strange claim that the mind seeking peace prevents peace, all the way here, to this moment, to this breath, you are already rising. The ordinary mind is the way. This moment is the path. The thicket is the ground of your awakening. Go gently, return often, and know that every time you return to the breath, to the present, to the open sky of awareness that has always been your deepest nature, you are doing the most important work a human being can do. This is the teaching. This is the practice. This is the path.